So as Kathy mentioned, today I'm going to speak to you all about some findings from research that Kathy and I started back in 2020 that has been ongoing. Some findings from this research that we've been doing with newcomer children and families and service providers here in Hamilton, but also wanted to share some reflections from doing this work and thinking about how we can do community engaged research with marginalized and equity seeking groups such as refugees and immigrants. So first, to give everybody a bit of context about why we should care about refugees and immigrants in our community. So as you can see, this is statistics from the last census period. We've got 1.3 new immigrants settling in Canada. And unlike in past years, we're seeing now that the majority are originating from Middle East and Asia, which is quite different from before when most immigrants were coming from Europe and North America. And we're also seeing a significant number, so almost 250,000 arriving as refugees, with the majority coming from Syria and Iraq because of Canada's commitment to resettling refugees from the Syrian war. We see these demographic shifts also represented here in our community in Hamilton. So we're seeing that 26% of the Hamilton population is foreign-born, and 35% of new immigrants in our community arrived as refugees. And we're really seeing that also in terms of language. I mean, I was astounded when I saw this finding from the last census that now in Hamilton, Arabic is the most common language spoken in the home after English. So why is this important for us as mental health researchers and clinicians? What are the implications of these demographic shifts? Now, we know that refugees and immigrants are obviously not a monolithic group, right? They are exposed to different risk and protective factors. But one way to understand why some groups might be more at risk of mental health difficulties than others is to think about it in terms of both their migration journey, but also the social ecological model that many of you will be familiar with. So you think about how refugee and immigrant children and families go through a journey, right? Starting from pre-migration in their country of origin, where they might be exposed to a number of different risk factors, such as exposure to war violence, and then peri-migration during their journey as they, for example, cross oceans or stay in a refugee camp. And then post-migration, for the lucky few who are able to make it to a country like Canada, they continue to face risk factors, but also processes that might protect them at the individual, family, community, and society level. It's also important to integrate a life course or a developmental perspective here and think about how prenatally children might be exposed to trauma that the mother experiences, poor nutrition, for example, and all the epigenetic processes that might occur, and also parenting processes as parents are exposed to trauma and various stressors that might affect the way they parent, which in turn affects children's outcomes, as we very well know. And then as children grow and develop, again, those different developmental transitions and how those intersect with their journey of migration and at different levels of their social ecology. So we know from a lot of research now that refugees and immigrants are exposed to a wide range of different risk factors that could increase then the potential for them to have mental health challenges. However, we also know from research that Kathy and others at the Offord Centre did on the Ontario Child Health Study, that if you look at refugee and immigrant children and compare them to their Canadian-born peers, there is a vast and persistent disparity in their access to mental health supports, as shown by this graph here, where we're seeing only 22% of immigrant children with mental health needs having mental health service contact compared to 50% of non-immigrant children. We also know that during the pandemic, of course, certain groups, including refugees and immigrants, were disproportionately exposed to risk. And so there is a strong likelihood that since the pandemic, we're also seeing these disparities further widened. So that's really to give you all some background about why we decided to embark on this program of research that we call Thriving Together. The purpose of Thriving Together is to engage stakeholders from multiple sectors that work with newcomer children and families in collaborative research, and also to promote knowledge sharing and uptake. And the purpose of this collaborative research is to really examine together what are the mental health needs that newcomer children and families face, and what barriers to care do they experience, and how can we work together across different sectors to improve access to mental health supports for this population, with the ultimate goal then of co-developing a framework and interventions that can better support refugee and immigrant child and youth mental health. I wanted to spend some time talking a little bit about our approach to this research. We took a community-based participatory research approach, and I want to spend some time talking about what that actually means in practice. So CBPR, as it's known, really explicitly acknowledges and tries to redress power differentials that exist in typical research, where you have the researcher in a position of power and the community, typically, especially if we're thinking about marginalized and equity-seeking groups, in a position of less power. And so CBPR as an approach came about to try and really address that power imbalance. And we do that through equitable partnership. And what that means is valuing different perspectives as equally valid and important, and making sure that those voices are represented at the decision-making table at every step of the research process, from conceptualization to design, implementation, interpretation of findings, and also sharing knowledge that's been generated and thinking about what this means for the community. And the final component of this approach is really thinking about research as a vehicle for social change. That is an explicit aim of this approach or this type of research, that it's not research for research's sake, but towards promoting some type of concrete change for the communities that we're serving. So in Thriving Together, we did this by establishing an advisory group that's composed of some of the organizations' logos that you see here today. Not all are represented, but to give you an example of the types of organizations that we engaged across health, settlement, education, and social sectors. And we engaged this advisory group, as you can see, through every step of the research process. So what do we actually do in this program of research? So we used a multi-informant and multi-method approach to really get a holistic understanding of the issues. So first, we conducted a key informant study with service providers, again, across different sectors, spanning leadership and frontline, to understand from their perspectives, working with newcomer children and families, what are the barriers that they're seeing to access. We also conducted a mixed method study, including qualitative and quantitative methods with government-assisted refugees that arrived in Hamilton very recently. And we then expanded that study to include newcomers who have arrived in the past up to 8 years, still focused on the Arabic-speaking community, because as I showed you before, we know that that is a large proportion of newcomers to Hamilton. So what I'm going to do today is give you a very quick overview and highlights from these studies. Try and think about what we can take away in terms of key learning and key findings from these different studies, and then also share some reflections about what we've learned so far. So starting with the provider study, this is just to give you an idea of who we spoke with As you can see, we achieved quite good diversity in terms of representation from different sectors, and also quite good diversity in terms of racial and ethnic backgrounds. So you can see, especially among frontline staff, less so for leadership, a large representation of providers from racialized as well as immigrant backgrounds. You can see in the bottom pie chart there, a large proportion born outside of Canada. So these are providers who are really speaking as well from their own lived experience, especially among the frontline staff. So this is a very high level representation of what we found. I'm going to go through these one by one, so don't worry about reading them all right now. But basically what we asked providers about were the barriers to care that they see newcomer children and families experiencing. And providers talked about these barriers in terms of structural or systemic barriers, provider level barriers, as well as individual or family level barriers. And then based on the discussion of those barriers, the providers then talked about suggestions for improving care, or what one of our participants referred to as reimagining the way that care is delivered to these families, with the ultimate goal then of promoting mental health supports for these children and families. So let's go through them quickly one by one. So at the structural and systemic level, we see a number of different barriers that providers mentioned. And some of these, of course, are not, they don't affect only newcomer children and families. You know, things like inadequate services and funding, as we know, is a national and global problem. However, we do also see that there are certain groups like immigrants and refugees who face additional or unique challenges when trying to access care. So one of those unique challenges is just how difficult it is for newcomers to navigate these systems because of language barriers, because of the complexity of these systems for someone who hasn't grown up here, who's coming from a very different context. We also see barriers in terms of cultural disconnects to how providers who are trained in a certain biomedical, for example, paradigm of mental health could be really different from the way that families from a very different culture and context might approach mental health and mental health supports. We also see a real lack of focus on prevention. One of the participants said something like, we either have 18 weeks of cognitive behavioral therapy, or we've got, you know, recreational activities for these children and nothing in between. So a real gap in that continuum of care. So this quote here really illustrates some of these barriers. This provider's talking about little pockets of funding here and there, but that system is fractured. And she says how she can appreciate, as somebody who's new, speaks a different language, has a different cultural understanding, how overwhelming that system can be to navigate. So moving on to the provider level, one of the key findings that came out from this research is just the real lack of diversity and lived experience, particularly among providers in the mental health sector. We're also seeing gaps in terms of cultural competency, certainly language skills within the mental health sector, but then also within other sectors such as settlement, where a lot of refugees would have, you know, initial contact with a service provider. Among the settlement service providers, a real lack of knowledge of mental health, how to identify mental health concerns, how to respond to mental health challenges, and where to refer families to. So we're seeing different types of gaps in knowledge and skills depending on the sector. Finally, providers, particularly providers from a racialized and immigrant background, talked about really high levels of burnout. They mentioned this not only because of just general staff shortages, especially during the pandemic and post-pandemic, but also because how, as racialized providers, they felt that the burden was often on them to then address the needs of specific cultural groups. So it's almost like they were pigeonholed and said, well, you have the skills, you have the background, so it's your responsibility rather than everyone's responsibility in the organization. And this quote here illustrates how these cultural differences can actually cause harm and lead to conflict within the family. So this provider says, if they, meaning the mental health provider, don't understand the religious and cultural foundation, concepts, mindsets, a lot of the time that results in a clash within the family, especially when seeking help for youth. The parent now feels that somebody is telling my child to rebel because it doesn't match with their cultural norms and practices. So finally, providers did speak about individual and family level barriers as well. Certainly limited mental health literacy, not knowing where to obtain available supports was a huge challenge that they mentioned. Also the fact that these are families coming with just urgent basic needs to find housing, find a job, learn English, and all of these daily stressors are so overwhelming that often mental health just is on the back burner. And they don't really have the emotional energy or wherewithal to even acknowledge mental health challenges, not to mention try and navigate that overwhelming system to try and address those. Of course, stigma and fear of negative repercussions came up a lot. That mental health is very stigmatized in many communities, and specifically for refugees, refugee claimants in particular, there are lots of fears around how disclosing a mental health concern could have impacts on their immigration status, could have impacts on their child being potentially taken away. So this was another barrier. And another one that came up a lot, and we'll see this later when we hear about the family's perspectives, is this idea that many families have of, we want to keep it in the family. We're going to deal with it ourselves. And so that means that it's only when the child or the family has reached a crisis point that they might go outside the family to seek more support. And that's what this quote here says. Oftentimes, we don't see newcomer families until things are very, very bad, usually because someone has intervened, like a child welfare agency or the school.
Okay. Okay.
So we did then ask providers to talk about, based on these barriers that they've discussed, what are some suggestions they have for changing the way that care is delivered to these families? And what was really striking from the responses was providers expressed a real strong desire for fundamental change. So quotes like unlearning and relearning, or dismantling the status quo. So providers were saying it's not enough to make these incremental changes or tweaks in the margins. We have to fundamentally change the way we approach, the way we deliver care. So starting from the top, providers talked about we need to engage newcomers, right? We need to stop assuming we know what they want and really engage them meaningfully at all steps of the process, to ensure then that we're really delivering care that is newcomer, family, and community centered. And the way that providers talked about this, a lot of them used the phrase meeting families where they're at. And they talked about this as meeting them where they're at physically, in terms of where people live, where they work, where they go to school in the community, but also meeting them where they're at psychologically, in terms of what does mental health mean to them? What does mental health support mean to them? And providing care in a way that resonates with those understandings and values. So this is one of the quotes that illustrates that, this idea of how can we rearrange ourselves so we're able to meet them where they're at and deliver care in a way that's comfortable for them, make a model that doesn't exist right now and meet their needs in a different way. And of course, that includes being culturally responsive, but it also includes paying more attention to mental health promotion and prevention, which, as I mentioned earlier, many providers saw as a huge gap, but also many families, as you'll hear later, saw as a huge gap as well. So this provider says it's the mental wellness, health promotion where we need more support. And if we could get more support in these areas, then that would take the pressure off the more complex clinical needs and address them earlier before families get to that crisis point. Some other recommendations are around the workforce and the need to really diversify and develop the workforce. So this provider said it's time to decentralize. You know, if you want staff to provide culturally relevant mental health services, you need to start training different types of mental health workers. So I thought that was really interesting because it has implications for, you know, what does it mean to be a mental health worker or support worker? What are barriers that are currently in place that prevent individuals from providing care because of the way that current policies or structures are set up? Providers also talked about new models of care that are more integrated and collaborative, breaking down those silos, for example, between settlement and mental health, and really bringing those sectors together to provide more holistic care. So this provider from a settlement agency said that he thought best practice is for settlement and health agencies to come together, to partner, because of those different knowledge and capacity gaps that I was talking about earlier. So he says he doesn't think most settlement agencies have the capacity from a clinical mental health perspective, but also health agencies don't have the capacity from a cultural perspective. And so bringing those two together makes a lot of sense. Oops, sorry. And then finally, knowledge generation and uptake, just making sure that, again, we're really engaging communities in this work from the very beginning all the way to the end in terms of application, and making sure that we're using learning for continuous improvement. Okay, so those are what we heard from providers. And this is now I'm going to start talking about what we heard from newcomers and some initial findings from our survey that we conducted with over 100 parents and a subset of their adolescents aged 12 to 17. And I'm also going to be providing some illustrative quotes from the qualitative responses that we received. An important note here is that the majority of our participants were from Syria and arrived as refugees, particularly government-assisted refugees. And I think that's important to bear in mind because, it means that in terms of understanding these findings, they might not necessarily apply to other types of immigrants and also refugees or immigrants from different cultural groups. But I think really important for us to bear in mind, given how Syrian refugees have settled in Canada in large numbers, and also how their experience might be reflective of now refugees coming from Afghanistan and elsewhere. So we see average number of years in Canada ranges from 0 to 8 with an average of 4. And adolescents were on average 14 years old, ranging from 11 to 18. So what we heard from the families is that they are continuing to experience significant socioeconomic stressors. And these range from affordable housing, just paying bills and having enough money for food and rent, and of course, employment. So these numbers show you the percent of participants who reported that this was somewhat or a big problem for them. The quote on the right here is from a single mother, and I think really illustrates how there are some then additional risk factors that intersect with these resettlement stressors to amplify risk of mental health concerns. So single parenthood was certainly one of them that we found, as well as low levels of literacy and education. It's worth noting that over 40% of the participants had only a primary school education, and about 4% had no formal education at all. So this mother said, praise be to Allah, I'm suffering, everything is difficult, I don't read or write, I go on the bus and don't know where to get off, I'm responsible for every single thing, and every day I cry 4 to 5 times. So really illustrating the impacts of these stressors. For parents and adolescents too, we asked about a range of social stressors. Language, of course, came up very frequently, but also strikingly here, just feelings of loneliness and isolation, especially among parents. No surprise then that what we saw is that newcomer parents' mental health is really suffering. Some useful numbers here. 40% rated their own mental health as poor or fair, compared to only 10.5% of the Canadian population. 38% said they felt so depressed in the last 30 days that nothing could cheer them up, some or all of the time. Trauma was a huge issue for almost half of the parents. Over 60% said it had a negative impact on daily functioning. And we did use the Kessler-6, a standardized measure of psychological distress. And 18% met the cutoff for severe mental illness. So clearly what we're seeing here is these stressors, both past and present, having a huge impact on newcomer parents' mental health. We're seeing, in addition to stressors, also poor self-rated general health, which was very significant among parents, but also protective factors. So family functioning and social support, those who reported more of those protective resources had fewer mental health symptoms. We're seeing also then in terms of newcomer child and adolescent mental health, a significant proportion are also experiencing distress. So 15% of parents rated their child's mental health as poor or fair, compared to 4% in the 2019 CHESI. We also asked adolescents themselves to rate their mental health, and 19% said it was poor or fair. And we're seeing, again, significant impacts on daily functioning, peer and family relationships, as well as schoolwork. We use the Oakes Emotional and Behavioral Scale to measure child mental health symptoms, both parent-reported as well as adolescent self-reported, to understand what factors might be associated with more or fewer mental health symptoms. And you can see on the right here, what you would imagine as the risk factors that increase mental health symptoms. So daily stressors, poor general health, also family conflict between the parent and child, as well as between adults in the home. And parents also reported that their own distress, as well as the male gender of the child, increased risk of mental health symptoms. On the flip side, more family functioning and positive parenting, and adolescents feeling a sense of school belonging, decreased mental health symptoms. Not surprising given the barriers we spoke about before, in spite of these mental health challenges, we're seeing that most families have not accessed mental health supports, either for themselves, parents for themselves, or for their children. So of those who did report mental health challenges, only 36% sought help for themselves and 33% sought help for their child. And almost half of the adolescents we surveyed said they did talk to someone about their mental health concerns, but that was mainly to a parent. Some of the barriers that they mentioned to formal help seeking are quite familiar. So preferring, again, to manage it within the family, self-reliance, not knowing where or how to get help, so that mental health literacy component, as well as some other barriers that we spoke about before around stigma and language. And I think really striking here to see the large number of parents and adolescents who said that they really knew very little about mental health services in the community. I thought this was interesting to highlight because it's quite in contrast to the literature and to my own work with Syrian refugees for my PhD, which really showed intergenerational impacts of trauma and mental health on children's on family functioning and child mental health as well. But in fact, what we're seeing here through our work is that parents and adolescents are actually reporting really high levels of family functioning and really positive parent-child relationships, as you can see from some of these numbers here. And the qualitative data is very consistent with these findings. So as this father said, it goes back to the family environment. The family is the reason for success and the reason for the family's failure. So there's real sense of the family being the core. And another insight into why it is that parents and children are choosing to focus inward rather than seek formal supports. So this is a really interesting quote. It says, "The child has only his mom and dad and family. There's no one else to help him. Not even a doctor is able to help him. Of course, God forbid, if it becomes a crisis, then there's medicine. But the issue from the beginning to end is it's the family. The family is first and last." And we wanted to understand this and unpack this a little bit more. Why this emphasis on keeping it in the family? And some of the things that we're hearing, especially from the qualitative data, gives us some insight into these intersections between culture, the migration journey, and mental health. So we're seeing here that parents are talking about how their role as parents is firmly rooted in culture and religion. So you can see the first quote here on the top right, where the mother says, "The mother's the foundation of the house. God has put paradise under the feet of mothers." So there's a link to religious understanding. And also this idea that parents have to appear strong and hide distress from their children. So in that second quote, this father talks about how in the Arab world, the father always has to be strong and not show his children that they are upset. And also because of their migration journey and everything that they've experienced and finally made it here to Canada, this idea that they have to prioritize the well-being and future of the children above all else, including their own well-being. So this quote at the bottom right, where he says, "My son is my whole life. I came here to secure his future. It's over for me." And finally, this last quote here I thought was really interesting because it talks about how the family has been the only constant in their lives. So this father says, "We've moved between 5 countries, 20 houses. The only thing that has stayed the same is my family. Everything else has gone, collapsed. And the only thing that has stayed is this family unit to support each other." And so I think this helps us understand a little bit why for this particular population, really relying on each other, keeping it within the family is so important and has implications then for how we provide support. So we did ask parents to share, as well as adolescents, what they would prefer in terms of support. So they talked about how they wanted to have in-person family and individual support and provided by individuals who have lived experience and similar cultural background and values. And here are some of the topics that they said they expressed interest in learning more about. So parents obviously talking a lot about parent-child relationships, but also how to manage their own stress and connect to resources in the community. And adolescents really talking about how they wanted to learn more about peer relationships and adapting to school and life here in Canada. So to sum up then, we're seeing that providers and families are really agreeing on this need for a holistic, family-centered, and prevention-focused care. And that includes addressing socioeconomic stressors, so those social determinants of health, really focusing on family and using family-based approaches. That includes caring for the caregiver, really caring for a parent's own mental health, and focusing on prevention and promotion, in part by investing in a workforce that can really relate to the needs and experiences of these families, and increasing outreach so families know where they can go to get support. I wanted to wrap up by sharing, as part of our community-based participatory research approach, we wanted to engage our participants in creative and arts-based methods to really reflect on the study findings and share what we learned with the community. So we partnered with a local arts organization here in Hamilton called Center 3, and we conducted a series of art workshops with the families who participated in our study. And these are some of the pictures from those workshops, which were great fun. People played music from their hometowns. We had food. One mother said this was the first time she had ever created any art. So it was really meaningful to a lot of the families and to us. And it also helped us create this video, which I'm going to play for you now.
What is it like to be a newcomer family in Canada, and how can we support families to thrive in their new home? To answer these questions, researchers from McMaster University spoke with 40 newcomer families from Syria, Iraq, and Sudan who arrived in Hamilton, Ontario from 2018 to 2021.
No one understands what it means to lose your home, your family, especially because of a war and not being able to go back. You don't have a family, you don't have friends, you don't have acquaintances, and you don't know the language or anything. How you started in life? That's something that's not easy at all.
The high cost of living and lack of affordable housing in Hamilton was particularly stressful for parents, and many described feeling overwhelmed and alone. Children, too, spoke about being separated from friends and loved ones and expressed a deep sense of isolation. I don't have enough friendships here. I feel like I'm on another track. Although adjusting to life in Canada was difficult at first, parents and children found ways to persevere and stay hopeful. Family and faith were most important. My whole life is dedicated to my family and my children. When I see them smiling, I'm willing to forget everything that I went through and everything that I will go through. Parents and children talked about what they love about Canada, the feeling of safety, the friendliness of Canadians, spending time in nature, and how this helped them to cope and adjust to their new lives. Teachers and settlement workers were also important sources of support. Our study found that many newcomer families are resilient and lean on one another to overcome past and present challenges. With a little more support, they can truly thrive in their new community. These three things can help. 1, provide more cost of living support so newcomer families can live with dignity and security. 2, create more opportunities for social connection and well-being, especially sports and recreation activities that bring together newcomers and Canadians. 3, support newcomer parents and children to cope with stress and loss in ways that celebrate their strength, culture, and resilience. Together, we can create a community where all of us thrive.
Well, there. Okay. So I don't know if you all recognize the map. That's a map of Hamilton that the families use as their canvas. And we were able to actually organize an exhibit at Hamilton City Hall to show this artwork to the general public. And we had an event launch, which was really lovely. This is actually a photo of me and the research team from that launch. I did want to just spend 1 minute kind of reflecting with everyone and maybe sparking some discussion around community-based participatory research with newcomer families, but also with other groups that might benefit from this approach. And I think what we really learned is just the importance of trust to engage with groups that are historically marginalized. And what do I mean here by trust? When I was thinking about this, I think it really boils down to relationships and reciprocity. Spending time to build those relationships was incredibly important. First, relationships with organizations that serve newcomers, because that was the only way that we could access this population. And it was really through those existing relationships that service providers had with the newcomers that they serve that people were willing to talk to us. You know, often when our research team would call a family and say, hi, we're from McMaster, we're doing this research study, the family would be quite wary until we said, and we're doing this in partnership with Wesley, with YMCA, organizations that they recognized and that they trusted. The other element of that trust is these people here on the screen, the team. Everyone on the research team had lived experience of immigration, being a refugee, being racialized. So they were personally invested in this research, but also could relate to the families in a really special way. The other thing that was really important here was around reciprocity. And I think it's important to think about this because we often think about research as sometimes one-sided, and which can then become perceived as extractive. But for these families in particular, they didn't approach it that way. They saw this as a two-way street. They wanted to share with us, but they also wanted us to give something back through these art workshops, through connections and referrals to other services. And it just made me reflect a little bit about how we traditionally approach research and thinking about values of scientific neutrality and objectivity. And what does that really mean when we're working with a population that actually views it in a very different way? The other thing to mention here is just that this is really, really time consuming. This kind of research is a huge investment of time and energy, but it's so important to put in that time to build those relationships in order to make it successful. And that also means being really flexible and responsive to people's needs. Obviously, for providers, this research is not their top priority. They see it's important, but it's really important for us to recognize that they have other very pressing and immediate concerns. And same with families. They're busy, they're stressed, and we had to work really hard to make sure that we were, again, meeting them where they're at in terms of when they were available, how they wanted to talk to us. We gave them all the different options: WhatsApp, Zoom, phone call, in person, at any time of day, evening, weekend. And that also means we had to change the way that we work. And then finally, just want to mention how, it was a challenge to reach children and adolescents. Again, we were seeing some evidence of parents kind of acting as gatekeepers and not wanting us to, not everybody, but a significant proportion not wanting us to speak to their children. So thinking more, especially in light of what we've learned, what are ways we can build that trust with parents and also use more creative, youth-friendly methods to reach children and adolescents. So just want to end by saying thank you, of course, to all of our families who participated, our team, the advisory committee, Kathy, and all of our partners and funders, and to all of you for listening today. Thank you very much.